Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's program. We're going to explore the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. For nearly 2 centuries, the U.S. Armed Forces and American industry looked to Springfield Armory for innovative engineering and superior firearms. The Springfield Armory commemorates the critical role of the nation's first armory by preserving and interpreting the world's largest historic U.S. military small arms collection, along with historic archives, buildings, and landscape. And we're going to learn about this wonderful National Historic Site with Park Ranger and Historic Weapons Supervisor, Susan Ashman. We again thank the Friends of the Library and the 35 partnering libraries. So everyone, please give a big virtual round of applause to Susan for joining us this afternoon. And Susan, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank everybody else for tuning in. I am so excited to be here. I love talking about the Springfield Armory and also our national parks. So I just wanted to let you know the Springfield Armory is a unit of our National Park Service, and we are one of 424 sites. Springfield Armory is located in Western Massachusetts in Springfield. And we manufactured small arms for the United States military for 174 years, from 1794 all the way to 1968. So 174 years of history, that's a lot of time. So I am going to skim through that history, and I will focus though on World War II, because that is when we had our peak employment at the Springfield Armory. So our big claim to fame is it was the only time the government oversaw production of military firearms for the US military. Now it is all in private hands. So on April 6th, 1777, Brigadier General Henry Knox, who is on the left side of my screen, he wrote a letter to Massachusetts Governor James Bowdoin stating why Springfield should be the location of our first national armory. So for those of you who are familiar with Western Mass and Connecticut, would you believe that Hartford was also in the run-in for the location of our first national armory, and also Brookfield, Mass, which is very surprising to me if you've ever been to Brookfield, Massachusetts. It is quite small. So Henry Knox wrote that letter to the governor of James Bowdoin, and some of his arguments why the armory should be located in Springfield was that Springfield had the advantage over Brookfield in the number of streams which empty themselves in the Connecticut River and on which there are many sawmills. Also, timber is more plentiful and more accessible in Springfield than Brookfield, and because of river transportation, and therefore less expensive as well. There are shops, there are stores, workmen readily available, as well as provisions and food. And Springfield is more plentiful than Brookfield. And describing the location, Henry Knox says, the plain just above Springfield is perhaps one of the most proper spots on every account. So I'm sure some of you are very familiar with Henry Knox and how he went to get cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, brought them back to Boston during the American Revolutionary War, and he would pass Springfield and this plain that he talked about. So that first picture I had of the armory, that is the location that Henry Knox was talking about at that time. So a federal arsenal was established here for the Continental Army in 1777 by George Washington and Congress. So it was an arsenal, not an armory. And the difference is an arsenal is where you store firearms, and an armory is where you manufacture those firearms. So again, it was just a storehouse here. So ammunition was manufactured, weapons were repaired, Army supply stockpile, they had some artillery here. And this was all good, but all during this time, we were importing firearms from France. And George Washington felt if we were truly independent, we were fighting for our independence during the Revolutionary War, why are we still dependent on these foreign countries for firearms? So George Washington wanted his own manufacturing site for these firearms. And so that's how they chose Springfield for that location. So when Congress authorized the founding of Springfield, or the location for the armory up north, he also chose one down south, and that's Harper's Ferry in Virginia at that time. It's now West Virginia. But it was not our sister site for very long, because when Virginia seceded from the Union on April 17th, 1861, it made Harper's Ferry a target due to the firearms and machinery there. So they thought the Confederates would go up there to try to stockpile those firearms to arm the Confederate Army. So Lieutenant Jones of the US Army went down there to guard the armory at that time with about 50 regulars, about 15 volunteers. And the Virginia militia, with about 360 men, advanced on Harper's Ferry to capture those arms. So Lieutenant Jones knew he was going to be outnumbered. He didn't have reinforcements coming. So Jones and his men set fire to that armory and its building to keep those weapons out of soon-to-be Confederate hands before retreating across the Potomac River. Now, it's interesting because about 15,000 firearms were destroyed in there, but since they had Southern sympathizers working in that armory, they were able to put out some of that fire, and they could put out enough of it where they were still able to salvage a lot of the machinery in there, and also some of the firearms. So General Stonewall Jackson went in there and he just took the rest of the machinery out of there, those firearms, and then he transferred that property to the Confederate armories in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Richmond. But don't despair, you can still visit Harper's Ferry today. They never did rebuild the armory after it was burned, but it is definitely a unit of the National Park Service. It is incredibly picturesque down there. They have some of the ruins of some of the buildings down there. And it's also, it's also on the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. And also for all you hikers, it is the halfway point on the Appalachian Trail. So when the armory was established, eventually there was 3 different campuses built. And this one here is the historic Hill Shops. So this was more quiet, this area here, because you had the commandant who lived here, you had the paymaster, you had the master armorer. Those 3 positions are the most prestigious at the armory. You have the center green there, and they wanted it more park-like, more quiet, because you had officers living up in this part of the campus too. This is also where the main arsenal is located, which is now our museum. So it is also currently part of Springfield Technical Community College. So they basically, the state owns the campus now at this time. Across the street is Federal Square. That was built in 1890 for the production of the Krag-Jorgensen rifle that was used during the Spanish-American War. This is now, again, owned by the state, and it's a technology park. Altogether, those 3 campuses, those make up about 90 acres of the original Springfield Armory. So the last campus are the historic water shops. And that, when George Washington authorized the armory in 1794, by 1795, those water shops were already online. They needed that water power. So what you see here is the Mill River. And it was the north and south branch would flow into basically Water Shop Pond, that big area. And then that would supply the water power needed for those machines. So that was an operation from 1795, those water shops, until the armory closed in 1968. So since we have so much history to cover, I'm just going to jump to basically focus on World War II at that time. So we're going to jump ahead about 80 years. So when Hitler ordered the invasion in Poland in September of 1939, the Armory's budget increased by 250%. Like they were ready to go. Employment skyrocketed at that point. You can see on the graph there. So women comprised about 20% of the workforce by June of 1942, but 43% the following year. So it really jumped. Between September and October in 1942, some 1,600 women were hired. And as the demand for weapons on the battlefield grew. So when you look at the chart, employment peaked at just under 14,000 employees in 1943. So I'm always surprised at the diverse workforce here. People came from all over the world to work here, as you can see, from China, Norway, Greece, Poland, Germany, Sweden, etc., who worked at the Armory. They were a civilian workforce. They did not live here at the Armory. We get that asked that many times, but they either lived in the local neighborhoods. I've also read when they lived further out, they would have buses that would bring these Armory workers in. And again, it was World War II with the peak employment just under 14,000. I also thought, like, why weren't there more women who worked here? It was 42% during World War II, but many men got a deferment, and that is why, because they needed that skill here. So the women who worked at the Armory in manufacturing were called WOWs, Women Ordnance Workers, because they worked for the Army Ordnance Department. So I'd like you to look at her bandana there. And a lot of people get them confused with Rosie the Riveter. So we know Rosie the Riveter has just dots on her bandana. But if you look at the WOW bandana, it looks more like a bomb. So actually, it's an iron hand grenade with a powder charge and fuse, which had to be lit before throwing. So similar to a grenade. And the use of the shell and the flame by the Ordnance Department dates back to 1832. But it's funny how rare you see these bandanas. And just in case you do visit the Springfield Armory, we do sell those bandanas, so you can get your own there too. So again, these are some of the women who did work at the Armory here, but there was an advertisement that the Army put out about these WOW bandanas. And it says, she wears the WOW bandana, water repellent, washable, dust proof. The WOW bandana, designed in accordance with U.S. Army specification, is an attractive, safe, and unifying head covering to identify women ordnance workers. Every woman in your plant will want one. So many of the women who did take jobs at the Springfield Armory took on many of the manufacturing roles once previously held only by men at that time. So they did feel that working at the Armory was more like their patriotic duty to help out the boys overseas at that time. So the Armory also attempted to pair specific women up with specific jobs according to their natural physical abilities. So just because you wanted to be a clerk doesn't necessarily mean that that's what your position would be at the Armory there. And it proved so beneficial. So they did take aptitude tests to see how these women fared in particular job categories at the Armory. And again, it proved very beneficial, cost-effective for the Armory as well. So the women work side by side with the men and have been doing so since World War I. So the first woman came and worked at the Armory on July 16, 1917, and she was an inspector at that time. So all these jobs were open to women here. They just did not work in admin. So this is the first time during World War I that women were working side by side with the men in manufacturing. So they were millers, dress grill operators, office clerks, inspectors. They worked on the assembly line. One even worked on the forge. This is Mary Smith on my right here. I'm not sure why she wanted to work at the forge, because it's a very hot job. It was before OSHA and air conditioning, and that was probably one of the worst jobs at the Armory. So I wish I could have talked to her to find out what drew her to that. And also how having women working here, how much the dynamics changed in the work area. But the best part of this, the best part about the women working here, which was basically unheard of at the time, is they got paid the same amount as the men did if they were doing the same job. So that was pretty much unheard of during that time. So at first, when they were looking for women for jobs here at the Armory, they were wondering why women were not working or applying here. And they found out the problem was childcare. They took note of this because they needed more help here. And they ended up opening up a couple of childcare facilities across the street and at the High School of Commerce, which is also across the street. So what was being manufactured here? So basically everything stopped and production was all about the M1 rifle. So anybody who knows, has relatives who fought in World War II, this is probably what they were using, the M1 rifle here. So the Garand, this was designed by John Garand, and he was born in Quebec, one of 12 children, and moved with his family to Jewett City, Connecticut. And he learned the machinist trade in the textile mills down in Connecticut. And then he also worked in the precision tool factories in Providence, Rhode Island, and New York City. He had a couple of different patents as well. And during World War I, he designed a lightweight, fully automatic rifle. He heard that the government was having a hard time finding a semi-automatic rifle, so he submitted a design. It was not chosen, but they saw his design and engineering capabilities, so his design was rejected, but he ended up getting a job here at Springfield Armory. So on January 9th, 1936, after 17 years of working under military specifications, the M1 rifle was accepted as the standard shoulder arm of the U.S. Army, and 4 years later by the U.S. Marine Corps. And General George Patton said, "I consider the M1 the greatest battle implement ever devised." So again, if your fathers, if they were in the U.S. Army during World War II, they probably talked about the M1 Garand or M1 thumb. That's another thing where you get your thumb stuck in when you're loading the cartridges in there too. So the first production M1 was successfully proof-fired, function-fired, fired for accuracy on July 17, 1937. So in 1940, 100 M1s were being manufactured each day. But by 1942, that number rose to over 1,000 rifles per day. Production of the M1 peaked in January of 1944 with about 122,000 manufactured in that month alone. So it was about, like 3,936 rifles per day, or 164 rifles per hour. So that's those women were either working on those rifle stocks or the barrels themselves or the trigger assemblies on the rifles, the sights on those. So you don't think too much about it, but you think about how many hands were involved in making these M1 rifles. So this is a cartoon, or I should say just a drawing that one of the employees did here. It's one of my favorite ones because you see the woman who's passing, she's an inspector, she has her micrometer in her hand. She's passing the M1 rifle over to the armory worker who is standing on a gear, and he is going to pass it onto a soldier. And then you see the Japanese coming over the hill, and that's the armory in the background. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Armory newsletter, where these cartoons, these drawings would be in, and it was used as morale during World War II. So the armory workers, they were called soldiers of production, and they worked round the clock here, 6 to 7 days a week. Occasionally, the shops at the armory were ordered to work 7 days a week for 2 weeks straight. Then the third Sunday was reserved for general equipment maintenance at that time. Third shift wasn't really discontinued here until about 1944. They worked all the holidays, including New Year's Day during World War II. You did earn an extra day's pay. And then on Thanksgiving Day, this is always kind of cracks me up. They were permitted to have a 30-minute lunch instead of the normal 20-minute lunch. So I am sure so many of us have worked holidays away from our families at that time. So I just want to read to you an excerpt. It's called The Soldiers of Productions, and it was in the Armory newsletter in January of 1942. And one of the employees wrote it. And it's just to give you an idea of how dedicated the employees were to making these firearms for the soldiers overseas, just how important it was to them. So we dedicate the work of our hands to our soldiers and sailors and all people throughout the world who want to live in peace and freedom. Our thousands of whirring machines stamp, cut, grind the parts that make the finest weapons of the world. As each workman senses his individual responsibility, our production rises and rises. Our fighting forces must have guns, tanks, ships, and planes. We will give them these weapons, shining, fine, accurate, made with our strength, our hands, our hearts, and our souls. This is our solemn and holy promise to the soldiers who are fighting for us and to the country which we love. We are soldiers of production in the shops and offices. We will keep the wheels turning night and day to produce the weapons needed for the defense of this nation and the perpetuation of our ideas. We pledge this. And this is the pledge of every true American. In the long days ahead, you can remember the promise, America. And remembering it, take courage, for the end of the road is victory for democracy, final and complete. So this is an employee that wrote this. They wanted to keep morale high here because they knew if morale was high, production was going to be better. So there was also cafeterias. They had 3 cafeterias on the post here. And this is so employees did not have to leave here. They did have guards on the gates here. And then also they'd like to know that their employees were also getting a hot meal at work. They also had blackout and air raid drills practiced regularly here too during World War II. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the Army Navy E Award. And this was presented to companies during World War II whose production facilities basically achieved excellent in production. And by war's end, the award has been earned by only 5% of more than 85,000 companies involved in producing materials for the war effort. That's not too many companies when you think about it, 5% out of 85,000. So the company, you basically need to vote for your own company. So you need to fill out an application themselves. And I have to say the Springfield Armory, somebody here, a clerk, was very good about filling out the application because the Springfield Armory was given this award for 4 times. But do you know who beat us out? Hershey Chocolate. They got the award 5 times for their ration D-bar. So when you did get the Army E Award, you got this little pin here. And then again, this is an employee badge. And then you got that E pin that goes on top of your employee badge as well. So the Armory newsletter, this is definitely a stage publicity photo here, but the Armory newsletter was published in-house each month during wartime by employees to increase morale. And this was even during World War I, they were doing this again. And this newsletter is quite a hoot. There is, they would encourage employees from different departments to submit news for the newsletter about wartime production, about like birth announcements, poetry, clubs, sports teams, news from the front line, from former employees, jokes, cartoons, etc. And there is no way that Armory newsletter could be published today. Well, probably not without a lawsuit, because it was quite sexist, definitely not politically correct at that time. But this, when you work at a company with over 10,000, or I should say just under 14,000 employees during World War II, you want to know what's going on in the different divisions. So they really encouraged getting together in these different divisions, so you knew what was going on or knew the employees, again, keeping that morale up. So again, happy employees meant higher production. So this is, again, one of the, a couple of slides, what some of those drawings would look like. Here's another one. They even added to the Springfield Armory on one of the Dr. Seuss drawings there. So another thing they would have is lunchtime concerts. And this is through the Federal Music Project through the WPA. And this was from about 1938 to 1943, but it was unfortunately phased out in 1943. And these were always very crowded. Whenever I see pictures of these were at all three campuses. They would have war bond drives during this time, or the musical concerts. And as you can see, it was not all work and no play here. Another morale booster was different clubs and teams. So can you imagine being able to do this on your lunch hour at your place of employment? So they had like every sport you can imagine here. They had bowling, tennis, golf, hockey, baseball, rowing, archery. They even had intramural sports here, which some of the pictures that I saw, they had this team, the women's basketball team was the Redheaded Amazons, and they played a men's team. And even though the women lost, like it was a close game. So even back then, you know, they were, I think they were a little ahead of their time. They had a club for bridge, for lunch. That's probably the club I would be in. Swing band, defense war bond, Red Cross, etc. So as I was saying earlier, like many of the teams would challenge each other. So this one was the 5 Bachelors. This was the name of their team from the water shops. Extend a challenge to any Bachelor girls team from the hill shops to participate in the bowling match. And stakes will be the match and supper to follow. And it's kind of funny because editors at the Armory News responded, while the Armory News is printing this item as received, it absolves itself of all responsibility should any romances develop. So I can't even tell you how many marriages came out of the Armory during World War II. So another thing that they had, one of the biggest dances here was the On to Victory dance. This was in February of 1943. Judith Kane, she was one of the female band leader at that time. It was held until 3 a.m. so that all shifts could attend. It was a big deal. The WOW bandanas were given out at that time too. It was a big morale booster. Employees were asked to sign a victory pledge at that time. And then also this was held at Springfield Symphony orchestra or Springfield Symphony Hall, I'm sorry, at that time here. So that was huge. And this is where they were giving out the WOW bandanas for the first time as well. Now, does anybody recognize this guy? Benny Goodman. He actually played here at the Armory on September 29th, 1943. And to commemorate this, we have a big band concert play every July outside on our historic grounds. So I will tell you more about that in a couple of slides here, just in case you want to dust off your dancing shoes and come here to the Springfield Armory in the summertime. So toward the end of World War II, that's when the layoffs started. Employment would never, ever be as high as it was during World War II. It just kept going down after that time. And of course, the first to go were the women. And so unless your husband was killed in action, you would be laid off at that time. So we're going to fast forward 11 years to 1956. The current chief of staff requested a report from the Army Material Command of the Arsenal System. And the main reason for this request was to find out if private contractors could manufacture firearms more efficiently than the government could. And on November 19th, 1964, the decision was announced by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara that the Springfield Armory was considered excess to the needs of the federal government. So needless to say, the citizens of Springfield were just completely shocked by this news. They had a delegation from Springfield that went to Washington, D.C. to plead the case to save the Armory, to no avail. And despite all these efforts, Robert McNamara still stuck to his decision to close the Armory. So on April 30th, 1968, a ceremony was held on the green in front of the Armory, or I should say the main arsenal, and the American flag was slowly lowered from atop the clock tower. So the last employees left the Armory this day, like the forge, the rail sidings, the laboratories, the firing ranges, the storerooms, officers' quarters, the administrative offices, sadly, all went quiet on this day. And basically the end of an era was over. This was the last time the government would oversee production of military firearms. And now, ever since 1968, it has all been in private hands. And that's another reason why you have so many private firearm manufacturers in this area when the Armory was in operation, because we worked with private contractors for most of our firearms. And so they kind of like wanted a piece of that contract. So even to this day, you still find some private contractors in this area, like Smith & Wesson, you have Savage, you had Ruger too here as well. So, but do not despair, because all is not lost. In 1978, the American flag was raised once again over the Armory, and its doors reopened as the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. So basically, the legacy continues here. So how did our collection start? How did we acquire this collection? So we have over 10,000 firearms here at the Armory. It started out as a technical collection for the engineers who were designing the firearms. The Army ordnance officers would walk the battlefields after a battle looking for unique pieces and would send them back to the Armory for research purposes. So as there has been a museum here open to the public since 1866. And it's pretty neat because it does like remind me of a library, how, you know, you acquire books. But here the Armory acquired these firearms from all over the world for research purposes. So there are two parts to our museum when you come in. It is located in the main arsenal. You have the industry side here, and that's about the research, the development, and manufacturing of the firearms. We don't have too much of the machinery here because a lot of that was auctioned off when we did close at that time, but we still have a few pieces here. And then on the other side of the museum are the firearms. And this is where you're going to see a lot of battlefield pickups and prototypes as well. And you can see straight ahead, we call that rack the organ of muskets. That is how they used to store the firearms. That is the last one. It holds approximately 1,100 firearms. And it was Longfellow who came here on his honeymoon. I think everybody should come here on their honeymoon. And he came with his wife, Fanny, and she's the one who said it looked like an organ of muskets to her. Being from California, we don't have church organs that look like this, but being in New England, you know, with the pipes and stuff, now I totally understand it. So you can come here and see that organ of muskets, and it does not play music. We get that asked as well. So we do hold that big band dance here. That is going to be, I do believe, the second Saturday in July. If you'd like to come, we'd love to have you. It is at 6 p.m. And it is, it's on July 15th. So if you'd like to do some dancing, come by and see us. We have a great Congo line every year as well. If you want to read more about Springfield Armory, an author came here a couple of years ago, and she wrote this book, The Wartime Sisters. And this is about two sisters who worked at the Springfield Armory. I highly recommend it. It's like light, fluffy reading, but I think you'll enjoy it to learn what it was like to work here as a WOW during World War II. And also, if you're interested, I do have a virtual book club. All the books we read connect with the National Parks Service sites. And we also have a guest ranger that joins us for each of our discussions. Our next one is going to be on Forgotten, the untold story of D-Day's Black heroes at home and at war. And so how that usually works is I turn it over to our guest ranger. He talks about his park site. You would see a PowerPoint, and then we discuss the book afterwards too. So if you're interested in that, there is my email address. And come and visit me. I love visitors. We are open Wednesday through Sunday year round. 9:30 to 4. We have ranger programs 2 times a day on weekends. I usually do like blank firing demonstrations, or we do a walk-in tour, or we talk about some of the exhibits, or I do a museum tour. It is also great for kids. We're not just about firearms, and there's also beautiful grounds to picnic on. So thank you very much. And I hope you guys have some questions, and please come visit me.
So folks, let's give Susan a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. I learned quite a bit. Very excited about your book group too. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I love it.
So folks, if you have any questions or comments for Susan, now is the time. Diane asks, did the male workers wear anything to identify them like the women had to?
No, they didn't. You know, it's interesting because of the hair with the women, it took accidents before they had to start wearing bandanas, hats, because of some scalpings that would take place with the machines. And so a lot of the men, some of them dressed quite nicely when they worked here with the shirts and ties. But then the women, they wore like dresses. They were dressed beautifully to come to work. Like women don't even dress like that to go to Walmart today. And it's surprising how nice they looked when they worked here.
Polly asks, does the M of M-1 have a meaning? Also, was it manufactured at other armories? Yeah,
so M means model. So anytime you have like an M1903, the model 1903. So basically like the year where it was designed. So that was a great question. And then was it manufactured anywhere else? Winchester also manufactured M1s. And then after World War II, We had International Harvester, who made the farm equipment. They were also manufacturing M1s, and also Harrington and Richardson, which I do believe they were at the Worcester area. So it was those: Springfield Armory, Winchester, International Harvester, and Harrington and Richardson. They are the only ones who did the M1 rifle.
MT asks, if they work 6 days a week, when do they find the time to play sports?
They did a lot of those on company time, and also like after work as well. So, but they, like I said, they really promoted that. So you would like those pictures of them playing archery. That was all done on company time. Also at the mill pond where I showed you the water shops, they would play hockey there, they would swim there, canoe there. So yeah, a lot of that was done during work time.
Lois just commented that she always had a misperception about what armories actually were. She thought that they were just warehouses for military equipment, didn't realize that they actually produced the arms. So there you go. An anonymous attendee has a comment / question. Maybe the armory had a diverse workforce because the population near the armory was quite diverse, and that's who applied to work there.
Springfield had a lot of firsts. They were also like the home of the Rolls Royce. So they had, you know, people working there. You also had Smith and Wesson. You had Milton Bradley. You had, yeah, a very diverse population here. But then also people who were living here would write to their relatives and say, hey, here's where you can get a good job, come and work. Another thing that was interesting is you aren't making as much working for the government as you would in a private industry. So I did mention that there was private manufacturers helping us make those firearms. And a lot of people would get trained here and then go to the private manufacturers because they can make a little more money too. So, but it's interesting, back to the diverse workforce, they had the different neighborhoods, like the Irish neighborhood, the Polish neighborhood, here in Springfield too. So that is a great point that he brought up, that, yeah, and then they just, those people who were working here would just write to their relatives and say, hey, come on over and work.
Lois notes that Harrington and Richardson were based in Fitchburg.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, Trudy has a question. I think the answer to this is yes, but let's ask the expert. Trudy wants to know, so the Springfield rifle, was that made in Springfield?
It was, and that was, when people say they have a Springfield, usually automatically they're talking about the Springfield 1903 that was used in World War I. So, because usually anybody else will say, I have an M1, or they'll say, I have a Springfield percussion that was used during the Civil War. So when they come in and they say, I have a Springfield rifle, that's the 1903, and that is Springfield here. But there was like Springfield Arms, and that was different than us.
So Patty says the book you referenced at the end of your presentation is a great book. Lucy and MC both say thank you. Patricia and Frank say bravo. Great presentation about an important part of our history.
That's
Let
awesome.
me jump back to the Q&A. So Gary asks, Susan, do you have any living history interviews of workers recorded at the museum? And how many of these workers are still alive? Would you have any way of knowing?
Yeah, so we do have some oral histories, mainly from the women, which is intriguing. And that's where I got a lot of my information about the WOWs, is from these oral histories. Like, their stories are hilarious, but mostly about the day-to-day, what it was like here to work here day-to-day. We had a Descendants Day. They are getting more rare. The numbers are getting smaller and smaller. We did do a Descendants Day last year, but I get more, it's mostly women. I get more women who worked here who are elderly who come in here just out of the blue and say they worked here, and then I will sit down with them or get their contact information. I had this one woman, the one that really stands out to me. She came in a wheelchair with her son, and I asked her what she did here, and she said she assembled trigger assemblies on the M1. So basically the whole trigger, if you pull it up, it just pops right out. And the thing is, I put an M1, we have an M1 like for educational purposes, it doesn't fire or anything. And I put it in her hands, and her hands automatically went to it, and she pulled out the trigger assembly. And we were all like in awe of that. Even her son was so surprised, but it was like by rote. It just came right back to her. So that was just amazing to see that. We're going to be doing another Descendants Day / Labor Day program the first Saturday of the month, where if anybody has relatives who worked here, we will tell you where you can get those employee records. We're going to have people talk to our archivist here too. So we're looking forward to that, but there's hardly anybody left. John Garand's granddaughter, she happens to work at Stick, the college here. So she comes by every so often and tells us stories about her grandfather.
Judy says, great presentation. Thank you. An anonymous attendee asks, were the women treated well and equitably compared to the men back then?
So like I said, if you were doing the same job as a man, you got the same pay, which I think was like way ahead of its time back then.
Yeah.
There was definitely like sexual harassment going on. Definitely the women changed the dynamics here, but I have to say there was also problems with the women chasing the men that would lead to problems as well that we have seen in some of the files that we have. So
Lucy says, my great-grandfather came from Ireland and worked his whole career at your armory.
Yes, nice. I hope she comes to visit.
Yeah. So Lucy, that was Lucy. So Susan, I'm going to circle back to you in just a moment for any last words, but we have answered all questions and comments. So folks, I just wanted to remind you that next Wednesday, May 24th at noon, we're going to be exploring the Lowell National Historic Park, which is the one I'm most familiar with. It's about 10 minutes from where I sit. So very much looking forward to that next Wednesday, May 24th at noon. So Susan, do you have any last words for us before we wrap it up?
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. I really, really hope you come and visit. I would love to give you a tour of the armory. Again, we have beautiful grounds. The museum's just on the first floor there. So please come visit, and thank you so much for supporting our parks. I hope if you guys want to sign up for book club, email me, but thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Susan, I'll include your email in the follow-up email I send out tomorrow. Folks, look for that email. It'll have the recording, a feedback survey, Susan's email address, and information about next week's talk. And normally I wouldn't do this, but we do have 8 minutes left, and Yvette does have a good question. We'll take one more question. Yvette wants to know, how is the armory organized for visitors, and how long should one be prepared to stay there?
So organized for visitors. So we have one floor. And if you just have a light interest in like the history and such, I would say you can do the visit under 2 hours. We have 2 sides of the museum, but we also have a 17-minute orientation film, and we have a great gift shop, which is always nice. There's plenty of places to sit down. And again, we have beautiful grounds, picnic grounds too. So I would say under 2 hours works out.
Excellent. Well,
and we
thanks
are
for answering that question. Yeah. I just put Susan's email address in the chat, and folks, you'll receive it via email tomorrow. Says thank you. Yvette says wonderful, thank you. So now we're really going to wrap up. So thank you so much, Susan. I hope you and the audience enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
All right, go Celtics. Bye-bye.